All right, welcome everybody. We have a great panel here today for international careers in the public and private sector, NGOs and other options. Rather than give a background for each, what we're going to do is we're going to hear from each of the members of our panel. I'll briefly introduce them. We've got Garth Massey here. We've got Mark Jenkins here, Robyn Paulekas, and David Wendt. And rather than spoil the endings of their stories for you, I'll let each of them introduce themselves and tell you where they've gone in life after leaving the University of Wyoming or perhaps coming back someday. So with that, I'll start with Garth Massey.
Thanks, Chris. I was the Director of International Studies from 98 to 2008 and happily turned it over to the incredible Jean Garrison. So that's basically it. I live in Portland, Oregon now. I'm writing. I've had a couple books I wanted to write and some consulting I wanted to do, and I'm working with the Navajo Nation on a case, and I'm working with some Native Americans in Montana on a case. So I'm doing some interesting stuff. So anyway, I think Jean has left, and that's probably just as well. I want to talk a little bit like a pedagogue and maybe talk a little bit different from what you've been hearing so far. I shepherded students for many years, and I'm incredibly proud of people like Garrett Cici and Robyn Paulekas, who have used their international studies degree very directly to work with international populations, work internationally. Nothing pleases me more than to get an email from a student who says, I'm doing refugee medicine in Zaire now, and thank you so much for telling me that this is something I could do with my life. But the truth is, most of you won't. Most of you won't spend a lot of time abroad. Most of you won't spend a lot of time working with international populations, but you're still in the right program, and that's why I want to talk about it in terms of two things. One is that, and I guess I want to do it through illustrations. The first one, I want to use my two sons. I have a son who's 28 and one who's 29, and they grew up very internationally. They both did studies abroad very successfully. They've both lived abroad since then, and both of them are in the United States doing wonderful things. One of them is a writer, and he's an environmental writer who certainly has a global perspective, but what he really has is the critical thinking skill that international, and I'm going to use the term international studies because that's the department I knew, that the international studies gives you. The ability to see things from different perspectives. And those of you who have already studied abroad or lived abroad know that that's one of the most important things. But also just learning a foreign language. You learn that the world is put together in a different way by virtue of that language. Last night, the talk was so interesting and so thorough. It was about America's challenges, but it was also very one-dimensional. It was a very standard pro-American perspective on what problems we have in the world. And my first question was, who's we? As if we're a unified nation, which of course we're anything but. And but I thought, this is a real teachable moment, because those international studies students are out there and they're saying, well, whose interests? The United States interests. Well, I thought we were talking about being global citizens. I'm not quite sure who he's talking about when he's talking about security. Whose security? And you, as an international studies student, have that critical faculty to ask that question, not to tear the speaker apart, but to use that as a teachable moment, that there are many perspectives out there, and there are many ways to look at situations, that you don't have the blinders of nationalism keeping you from looking at the way the world appears to other people. And I thought that was a good teachable moment. And I was thinking, for instance, of the Ukraine. I heard the speaker talk about 2 weeks before Yanukovych left office in the Ukraine. I heard Steve Cohen talking about the situation. boy, you don't hear that kind of perspective on American media. You don't see it in the New York Times, which you should read every day. I agree with the earlier speaker. But the fact is that Steve Cohen looked at that situation dramatically differently. And he said, now let's look at this from Vladimir Putin's point of view, which you can do, which you are invited to do because you are a student of the world. You are a global citizen. And Cohen looked at it so differently, and the whole situation, the whole crumbling of the Ukraine government, the Russian response, makes so much more sense. You don't have to think it's a good thing. You don't have to like Vladimir Putin, but you as an international studies student know that there are many perspectives out there that you have to embrace. The second thing, since I'm going to be getting this 8-minute thing in just a minute, it goes to my other son. My first son is a writer. He's an environmental writer. The second is a food guy. He is passionate about agriculture in an alternative fashion. And he spent 4 years farming. He spent 2 years in the Peace Corps. He's heading for Vermont to study, finally, sustainable agriculture. Now, why do I raise that? Well, because you have the skill sets to not just think about food and Safeway or food and American farm policy. You have the capacity to think about food around the world in different settings. For instance, industrial agriculture is absolutely, totally, entirely unsustainable. Anybody who tries to export industrial agriculture is an irresponsible global citizen. That is going in the absolute opposite direction. And you who have taken international development, who have thought about comparative agricultural systems know that industrial agriculture is the absolute wrong way to improve the situation of people in poor countries. What they have to do is build community around local, sustainable, self-supporting agricultural systems. How do you know that? Because you're an international studies student. You have all kinds of substantive knowledge that allows you to do one of the two most important methodological tasks before you, and that is comparative analysis. You know how to compare analysis. You don't have to look at just American food systems. You can look at food systems around the world and begin to make sense of what things are working and what things are not. And we know industrial agriculture is not working. And I've done a lot of international development. My first 15 years abroad were international development, and we all know that it's a wreck. Now, I want to say just one more thing before Chris hands me the piece of paper that says, get off the mic. And that is that I would like to control your choices of careers. And so I'll leave you all my email addresses. But I know that none of you are going to avail yourself to me. But there are two things I'd like you to think about. One is the work you do is the person you become. The work you do will determine the kind of person you are. If you don't believe me, we'll talk about it in 50 years. Will I still be alive? No, no. Y'all still be alive, okay. And so I want you to think seriously about the kind of work you do, but that doesn't mean, and this panels have been great, doesn't mean the first job's going to be the job you're going to do the rest of your life, because you're not going to do one job the rest of your life. You're going to do many, many different jobs. But the second thing is I want you to think about I don't want you to think about the stockholders. I want you to think about the stakeholders. I want you to think about, as an international studies student, who the work that you're doing impacts. Who is really involved? You don't just think about the one that's involved that has all the power. You've got to think about all of the stakeholders in the situation that you're working in, the kind of thing that Garrett Chichi does when he works abroad. But you need to do this in every job. You can't just think about what's the bottom line for the people who are writing my paycheck. You have got to think about all of the stakeholders, and I hope you will. So pick your job carefully. There are 3 pieces of advice I can give you. Buy a good bed, because a third of your life will be spent in it, and your greatest pleasures will happen there. Second, get good cookware, because the food you eat is going to be cooked in it, and that's going to make you who you are. And the third is get the job that's going to make you the kind of person you want. Okay, that's enough.
Well, thank you very much. Good advice. Appreciate it. All right. And I hope the other members of the committee can come up with 3 kernels of wisdom that equal those 3. And up next, we'll hear from Mark Jenkins. Here you go, Mark.
Okay. I don't have good cookware. I'm usually camping, so I have titanium cookware, and I'm often sleeping on a foam mattress in the wilderness. So I haven't followed your advice to the T. Garth and I are good friends. I am the writer-in-residence here at the University of Wyoming, and I am also a contributing writer for National Geographic magazine. And I have a few points. Like Garth, I don't want to spend too much time on career, but they've asked us to. So I got a philosophy degree at the University of Wyoming in 1983, and I was probably 2,000 years too late to get a job. Aristotle had the last job as a philosopher, I think. So I thought I'd be a writer. So I moved to Boston, where Atlantic Monthly was published, and thought, all right, this is it. I'm going to just do it. Of course, I didn't publish anything. I worked as a tinner. That's a person who puts in heating ducts. For 2 years in condos, came back, got a degree in geography from the University of Wyoming, and by that point I was making kind of your peanut butter and jelly sandwich, sardines, live in a basement living. Some of you still know what that's like, right? Come on. And so my tracks were either, okay, I should probably get a PhD in geography or global studies, or I should try to see if this freelance writing will work. So I went down, I thought, okay, at that time I was already publishing some stuff, and I thought, okay, I'll go down and I'll talk to Joe McGowan, who is the bureau chief at the Associated Press in Denver. And I went in with all my tear sheets and I said, I want to be a foreign correspondent. Send me anywhere in the world. And I'd already traveled around the world a bunch, on my own, hitchhiking, whatever. And he looked at my tear sheets and just pushed them back and said, you have to go back to one of those small town newspapers and work there for 5 years, and then work at another one for 5 years. And basically he just read me the riot act and said, who are you? Get out of my office. And I was crushed. So I walked down the street and I bought an airplane ticket to Nairobi, which is my normal response to so many things, buy an airplane ticket. And so after that, I landed in Nairobi, and it's a very long story I can't share, but I was working for the Associated Press within 3 weeks. And within 6 weeks, I was working for Voice of America, Reuters, because I spoke German, Time magazine. So the first thing I'd say is that it does pay off to follow your passion. I think it's always crazy. I speak in so many classes and people are majoring things that they're not sure they even care about. That's pointless. You're on the wrong, if you're in this room and you're majoring something that you don't like, in fact, if you're majoring something that you're not passionate about, stop right now. Go do something else. Come back when you have something you really care about and you want to put your time into. Okay, so now I want to say a few broader general remarks that I see as what happens when you become a global citizen. The first one of which is tolerance. I think you develop a sense of tolerance for other cultures, and that's what we don't have in this country right now. We have an enormous amount of intolerance. The other thing, you become a defender of secular society. I've spent a lot of time in countries where there is a theocracy in place, and they are, in general, horrible for the middle class. The rich are always rich. The top 10%, they're always going to be there every culture. The poor are always poor. There's bottom 10%, they're going to be there in every culture. Look at the 80%. So defending secular society, civil society. When you lose civil society, I was on assignment in Congo recently. It's a good place, a good example of where when you lose civil society, just basic secular functioning of a government, the middle class is destroyed. 5.2 million people have died in the Congo in the last 20 years, and we don't even hear about it, right? Okay, the challenge that I see for the people in this room who are going into careers is one of battling to defend facts and science. And I was just talking to Michelle about this. Right now, it's hard to have conversations about international issues One, because people are undereducated about the subjects, and two, they aren't basing their arguments on facts, on science. They're basing their positions on opinion. And that's something you learn in global studies, is to distinguish between fact and opinion. And in this state particularly, where we have a very provincial legislature that is taking the state backwards, like in terms of science, so I know some people are going to kill me, but I got to say it when I have my opportunities. I got to tell you, we are a global world, and this is a global state. What happens in this state affects the world, and what happens in the world affects this state, and you have to think about that. It's not just about what's going on in your little neighborhood. We're all interconnected. Good example, probably everybody in this room has a cell phone or a laptop. There's a mineral in that called coltan that is a big mineral for, you have to have it. Basically, it's what stores much of your memory. Anyway, that is mined in the Congo, and it has to do with the civilian deaths there. So everything you do is global already. Look at the back of your t-shirt. What does it say, Bangladesh? You're already a global person. Then you have to act like one. That's enough for me.
All right, excellent. My name's Robyn, Paulekas, and I currently work for Meridian Institute, and I'm doing some international stuff, so I'll tell you about that in a little while, but first I'll tell you the story of sort of how I got there. I'm originally from Laramie, and like many Wyomingites, and particularly folks from Laramie, I was anxious to get out. And I was sort of looking at the broader world and looking for opportunities to get away from Laramie, whether it was go to school, travel internationally. So I ended up taking a semester off between high school and college, and traveled to India and Nepal, and kind of got my adventure out of my system, and then came back, thought really hard about school, decided that the University of Wyoming just offered tremendous opportunities, and couldn't say no to it as much as I tried. And it ended up just being a wonderful fit. It is, as I heard on some of the earlier panels, I think that it's unparalleled in the access to tremendous top-notch researchers, high-quality faculty, smaller class sizes, just really great opportunities that I wouldn't have had in many other places. I ended up majoring in international studies and environment and natural resources. I was also in the honors program, which is also a really neat opportunity on campus, and was able to sort of piece together classes that were interesting. I had several self-initiated independent studies, including one with Dr. Massey over here, that were really great opportunities to dive into things that I was interested in more detail, and dig into those as part of my undergraduate degree. And this is really when I started my interest in the work I currently do in collaboration and creative problem solving and in conflict resolution. I then graduated and once again was bound and determined to get out of Laramie, and just couldn't. I found a really wonderful job opportunity at the Center for Volunteer Service in the basement of this building, which I think has since evolved to the Student Leadership and Civic Engagement Office. But it was their first full-time coordinator, and helped launch the Alternative Spring Break programs, the AmeriCorps programs, and some other just really cool stuff that was going on campus. I then worked for Environment and Natural Resources for a year, and that was, for me, it was a really great opportunity to find out more about the type of jobs that are out there in the fields that I was interested in, and kind of refocus before graduate school. I ended up going to graduate school at Oregon State University and focusing on water conflict within their geography department, and I did some really interesting work in the Klamath Basin. It's this really interesting situation that involves tribal water rights, agricultural interests, dams, and endangered species. So it certainly was a good place to study water conflict. A lot of my focus at that time was sort of shifted away from international work, and that was somewhat intentional. I at that point in my life realized that I really wanted to live in the American West, and I really was not that interested in living in Washington, D.C. or on the West Coast, or in any of the large cities on the West Coast. And I maintained some interest and focus on international studies, but at that time, I wanted to make sure that I had enough skills that I could get a job in places that I wanted to live, and maintain those networks in places I wanted to live, and so really focused on Western natural resource issues. all of that sort of led me to my current position. I'm a mediator at Meridian Institute. I'm assuming most people in here have probably not heard of Meridian Institute or the type of work they do, so I'll give you guys a little bit of an overview of it. Meridian brings people together to help solve problems, which sounds like a nice grand approach. The issues that we work on are usually complex and controversial. We work on agriculture, environment, natural resource, national security, health, really across the board on the most complex and controversial issues facing society. And we are sort of the process experts. So we bring people together, we facilitate meetings, we mediate, and we oftentimes act as a sort of trusted, neutral third party for these really complex issues that involve multiple stakeholders. Some specific projects that I've been working on or have worked on, I'm involved in a project where we're facilitating a steering committee and coordination to address aflatoxin in Africa. Aflatoxin is a mold that gets in groundnuts and maize, which are large parts of most African diets. And there's some really simple solutions, and but there's not necessarily the capacity to scale those up or to share those lessons learned. And so working on that project. Another one is I'm currently facilitating a series of public meetings for the Flathead National Forest. So this is a domestic project, but it's up in northern Montana. And we're starting a dialogue with various stakeholders on some of the contentious issues like wilderness designation and timber harvest and some of the recreational access questions. And then a third big project that I've been working on for the past 3 years relates to the climate negotiations. The UNFCCC is the acronym. Most people know the Kyoto Protocol is sort of the last big agreement that most people are familiar with. Agriculture was not originally included in the negotiations, but the agricultural sector is the third largest producer of greenhouse gas emissions. It's also the sector that's most likely to be impacted by the effects of climate change. And as you'd imagine, when you're talking to country negotiators, agricultural issues are absolutely very difficult issues. For many countries, food security is equal to or even more important than national security. It's the most critical issue that their country is facing. So when you're trying to start an international dialogue about agriculture and climate change, it's a very tricky subject. Meridian was approached by a set of negotiators that said that they wanted to better understand the issues that were at play. They wanted an opportunity to talk with each other outside of the formal negotiating process and start to kind of understand and unpack some of the major issues there. And so we facilitated a number of meetings and convened a team of expert authors, and they ultimately produced this report that was well informed by the negotiators. We had 2 consultations with negotiators from around the world where they had an opportunity to say, here are the major issues we're worried about, and here's a issue that you maybe don't want to go into because it's too politically sensitive. We went into them anyway because that was actually what needed to happen. And at the end of that, we had this great report. It's available on the website. Negotiators said that's really wonderful. But what was really helpful was to sit together in a room with the other agriculture negotiators and talk through some of these tough issues. And so at the request of mostly developing country negotiators, we've been facilitating informal dialogues about every 6 months, and we get them together in a room. They get a chance to talk through the issues. It can be topics like GMOs, it can be trade, but it's an opportunity to informally, outside of the formal meeting room negotiations, to talk through and understand each other's positions. So that is a little taste of the work I do. Meridian itself, since being in Laramie, I've run into a number of people that have worked with Meridian on a number of different topics, from nanotechnology to agriculture, domestic agriculture policy. So that's really just sort of the tip of the iceberg. And this has been a really good opportunity to sort of reflect on my career and how I got here, and then reflect back on what advice I would give my 20-year-old self. And so I came up with 4 major points, and I will note that they are identical to many of the things I heard on this morning's panels. So in some ways, I'm sort of reiterating those. I think it's neat that some common themes are sort of emerging, and that maybe the students that are in this room can leave with these 4 points. One of them is I feel like much of my career is what it is because I said yes to interesting opportunities as they came up. I heard that I heard multiple times today to sort of follow your passion, and I might sort of challenge that and say that I didn't know what I was passionate about, but I knew it was interesting. And so in my case, rather than following my passion, I was sort of following my interests, and that led to sort of developed my passion. And I think there's sort of this tension between knowing where you want to go and narrowly following one path, and keeping all possibilities open. And I think inherently by accepting your first job, you do close some doors, but don't let that stop you from saying yes to interesting opportunities. And that has to happen. That's what growing up is, and that's what defining your career is. And I think the Volunteer Center is a great example of that. It wasn't the career that I wanted for the rest of my life. There are people that are very passionate and very great at student services, and I absolutely loved it for the 2 years I was doing it, but I knew that I wanted to get back to creative problem solving, to conflict resolution, to natural resources, international studies. My other big piece of advice, and I don't think I've heard this before, is to consider taking time off before you go to graduate school. And I know that there's a lot of undergraduates out there that are smart, and you have great faculty mentors, and they're saying, oh, there's this really interesting graduate program, or you would make a great academic someday. That may be true, but I still think that almost everyone would benefit from taking 1 to 3 years off between undergraduate and graduate school. I think it gives you an opportunity to get an idea of what else is out there, and to understand what careers are out there beyond what happens in academia. Not to say those aren't wonderful careers, they are, but there are other options. One note on this is Meridian Institute has a fellowship that's designed for recently graduated undergraduates, and it's a 2-year opportunity, and it's designed with that in mind. It's designed to give you a taste of the work that Meridian does, expose you to the network and the type of projects we work on and the people we work with the knowledge that you'll likely go back to graduate school or move on to some other interesting job. We are just now selecting our fellows for next year, so it's no longer available for 2014, but we usually post the announcement in November, and it's on our website, and I'm happy to give anybody more information about that if you're interested. 2 more points. One is, I was thinking about, one more point. And it's something that I've heard from other people, which is that networks are absolutely critically important. Very few people get a job by finding it on a website and applying to it. You need to meet people, talk with them, and sort of build those relationships. And I'll end there.
Thank you.
Well, I'm going to stand so I can see you all. My name is David Wendt. I'm with the Jackson Hole Center for Global Affairs, which is Wyoming's only bipartisan independent think tank. So we like the new Center for Global Studies, and I congratulate Jean and David and all of you folks here for this wonderful opportunity for interdisciplinary research on global issues. But we analyze global policy issues from a policy perspective. So we're a public policy research institute, PPRI, dealing with global policy issues. And basically what a think tank does is incubate policy ideas for the policy process, the legislative process, and the governmental policy process. I'll give you an example. For example, the whole concept, the policy approach of cap and trade, which many of you have heard a lot about in recent years with respect to climate change policy. Cap and trade is a market-based approach to climate policy. It's not top-down regulation. It's setting goals and then letting the private sector figure out how to reduce emissions, in this case, on the most cost-effective basis. And that concept originated from a think tank called Environmental Defense Fund back in the late 80s, and was incorporated into the US Congress in legislation in 1991, which revised the Clean Air Act to incorporate this market-based approach for control of sulfur dioxide emissions, which put a premium on reducing sulfur dioxide emissions in power plants. It was a boon to the coal industry here in Wyoming because we happen to have low sulfur coal. And so this was an example of how a think tank incubates policy ideas for the and hands them off into the legislative and the policy process. At the Jackson Hole Center for Global Affairs, we're an incubator for clean energy policy. And we've been working for the past 10 years with policymakers and business leaders and technical experts in Wyoming and in China's largest coal-producing province. Those are the two largest coal-producing jurisdictions in their respective countries to reduce carbon emissions from coal. And we'll be taking a group of legislators, Chris's colleagues, over there in another couple of months to have discussions on clean energy policy with their counterparts in the Shaanxi, China Provincial People's Congress. So that's what we do. The world of think tanks, and that's really a narrower slice of our panel today, which is non-governmental organizations. I'll try to speak a little bit more broadly in the closing minutes of my time on international NGOs. But in terms of the world of think tanks, the funding model is you basically bring your own funding. You bring your own funding. Now, if you're a senior guy like Scott Harris, you know, you can come to an organization like the Atlantic Council of the U.S., where he's senior advisor, and basically bring your own funding. But I know a lot of policy centers in Washington, D.C. The Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, the Aspen Institute has a large office there, the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, the Brookings Institution, more on the liberal side, American Enterprise Institute, more on the conservative side. It covers the whole political spectrum, the Hudson Institute. You basically have to bring your own funding. Now, for you folks here we want you to seriously consider the opportunity to work with us at the Jackson Hole Center for Global Affairs on the issue which we feel is the defining issue of our times, the issue of global climate change. And what an opportunity for us here in Wyoming, the largest coal-producing state in the country, to address that issue. And so I want to invite you to consider that possibility, either relating to climate change or natural resources, sustainability. There's been a lot of discussion about sustainability today, or other global issues that might be of interest to you. If you can find a research grant here at the university that would enable you to pursue this research in Jackson Hole at our center, that would be great. If you have an idea for a policy project, doing a research project looking at some of these issues in a new way, coming up with a new idea, convening some policymakers to build some ideas for a new policy approach relating to these ideas. That's what policy projects are. Come to us, we'll talk with you about it if it fits within our institutional agenda. We'll help you work it up into a funding proposal. We'll help you get it out there to potential donors, foundations, and maybe that'll be a go. And you can come work on that policy project and direct it under our auspices. My colleague Olivia Meggs, Olivia, if you want to raise your hand back there, and I would be happy to talk with you about this. I've got materials. We've got materials outside on the Jackson Hole Center for Global Affairs, but Wyoming needs your ideas, and so come to us with them. Just in my last minute or two, let me talk about the broader world of non-governmental organizations. So many issues that so many of you have discussed here today: international human rights, the Amnesty International. I mean, the hands-on organizations that are out there, which are not think tanks. Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, the Lawyers Committee for Human Rights, the multiplicity of international development organizations or humanitarian assistance, Save the Children, CARE, World Vision, conservation organizations, Conservation International, Nature Conservancy. They have a World Wildlife Fund, offices all over the world. Opportunity, Refugees International, it goes on and on and on. So my advice to you, again, and I think Robyn put it right, you may not know yet what your passion is, but find out what you, decide what you're interested in, then learn as much as you can about that field. Don't hesitate to get in touch with folks and have an information interview with folks like Garth in the field, Lutheran Relief. Get his advice. People who are in the field love to mentor, love to give advice. I'm not beneath it myself when I'm starting a new project. I go have an information interview, build your own network. But last and not least, don't leave out the policy dimension. Don't lose sight of that, even if it's not a think tank, because it's the policy dimension that interconnects the issues, that interconnects the opportunities, that points you to the opportunities outside your particular organization, where you can partner, let's say, with a business organization that's also interested in supporting work in that non-government organization in the field. So I'll close it with that, and it's wonderful to be here at the university and see all of this wonderful young energy and enthusiasm. Thank you.
All right. Thanks to our panelists, and we've got plenty of time for questions left. If anyone has a question for one of our panelists, please raise your hand. We'll get you a microphone to ask the question, and please introduce yourself prior to asking the question if you would. All right, any questions? Got one right over here.
This is probably directed at all four. Eric Franklin, Casper College. I'm going to go back to what Garrett said this morning. One of the things you're encouraged in academia especially is don't job hop. You know, that gives you sort of inconsistency. You have one-year appointments. No, you don't want to hire that person. And so we're sort of getting a message here. It's a different message that it's okay to be experimental. It's okay to take these part-time or this project or so forth. And so is that a valid advice that we can relate to the students here as well as other students?
Great. All right, who on the panel would like to answer?
My personal opinion is that I think that I think there's a balance to be struck, right? I think that the career world right now is very different than it was previously, and I think it's expected that people move around to a certain extent. I especially think a lot of early career people end up, you know, in those first 5 years, I think it's very normal to take an internship for a year and then maybe be in a 2-year position. And those are sort of the building block positions. And then at that point, when you know what you want to do and where you want to go, to sort of buckle down and focus and dive deeper into the field and find an organization you're passionate about. That's at least the model that I've taken, and I've seen it be fairly successful in others. Other thoughts?
I agree completely. I think when you're young, you should take every opportunity, just as Robyn said. For example, in my field of magazine work, the average time for an editor at a magazine is now 13 months. So that gives you an idea of how fast things are moving in the magazine world, people shifting around all the time. Same with the film world. So certainly between 20 and 30, I think it's valuable to move around. And also, you can't move up without moving around in American corporate world. That's, you'll hit a ceiling of some kind. And you need to have the courage to say, I'm out of here. And you go someplace, and then you can come back to that place and say, I'm worth twice as much, hire me. And oftentimes they will. So I don't think it doesn't serve you as a young person to just stick in one place. I don't feel.
All right, Garth or David, anything to add?
I would just suggest that you give the mic to Garrett and let him answer the question he didn't answer in the last session.
There we go.
And so, So I was on the panel earlier for the alumni panel for any of you who weren't here, and I've worked, when you look at my resume, I've worked for the Red Cross, I've worked for Catholic Relief Services, and now I'm working for Lutheran World Relief. I did the Peace Corps, and I'm 32 years old. So in a traditional sense, that wouldn't be ideal. But in particular within the international development sector, a lot of the work that is done is project-based. So it's not necessarily that I'm jumping around, and I think if you have good reasons for why you jump, then you have no issues. If you don't have a good reason, then you're going to run into problems, because when you're going to look for that next job, they're going to ask you, obviously, okay, why did you not stay for very long with this company or this organization? And so I think it's just important to be strategic about what you're doing, but I think gaining those experiences and from multiple organizations gives you a good perspective where you can be creative and you can look at things and take, once again, like I said, those various parts of tidbits of knowledge and put it into a whole. So.
Great. All right, another question. Anyone have one? Surely there must be another question. There we go.
Thank you. My name is Sixtine Sia, and I'm from France. And my question is for you, Robyn. What is your fourth piece of advice?
Excellent question.
That's excellent. Thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity. My fourth piece of advice is to think about your career in terms of building blocks. And many career paths have an international component. As we found from all the panels today, there is no such thing as an international career or international studies career. It's many different careers. So I don't think it's too early to start thinking about what else you might be interested in. For me, I think that ultimately came in the form of good communication skills, good writing. I find I've been reviewing applicants for our fellowship, and the number one thing that makes or breaks a candidate is their writing skills. And so if you're interested in the type of work I do, that's where I would encourage you to put your focus. But I could also see a student that is an engineer or something like that and is sort of building those skills in other places.
Great.
My name's Margot Hutchinson, and career development is my thing. I think this is absolutely fantastic that you're giving this type of a situation for students. I think every single department on campus should be doing this twice a year minimum. I mean, this is where it's at. This is how you do things. Totally project-based. We were, saying that 20 years ago. That's exactly what it is. And of course you can job hop. My sister Jean would disagree with that sometimes, but that's how I've done my career. There's always something else that you can be doing. Right now I'm substituting and making lots of money and having a darn wonderful time, and I'm semi-retired. Anyway, so I think this is just absolutely fantastic. I'm glad to hear from all of you, and I love the advice that you're giving students.
Great. Other questions? Got one over here. Oh, excuse me.
Yeah, sorry.
There you go.
I was just curious if you have any tips for how to improve your communication skills and your writing skills outside of taking college classes.
It's a great question. Mark?
Writing is rewriting. So if you've done, this is true with me as well. I think that people often think of writing, it's just a literary form of communication, and you're trying to, if you don't have something to say, you don't typically write. So in my own case, for instance, I'll write a piece and it'll be horrible and no one sees the first draft. And then no one sees the second draft either. The third draft, I read it to my wife and she'll go, oh my God. And then I'll do a fourth, and probably an editor never sees anything earlier than a fifth draft. So practice. I know that's such a boring answer. That was my immediate response to your question, and then I thought, what else can I say? The other thing that I think is valuable that's kind of underrated now is public speaking. It's a very underrated skill, and people often avoid those types of classes because they're afraid of being up in front of people. But if you're going to go into many fields require some ability in public speaking. So take a class in that and get used to getting up in front of people and speaking.
I would agree, of course. How can you disagree with Mark? Because you ever see his muscles? Anyway, there's one more thing and that is to read. Whenever I want to get into a real writing mode, I make sure that I read things that I know are good. So years ago, my publishing wasn't going the way I wanted it to. I took a subscription to the New Yorker. It's the best writing in the nation. So you read and you stop and think about, why am I impressed with this? Or start a short story and you say, why am I still reading this short story? I don't have time. And you see how other people write. And I think reading is the greatest thing you can do. Now, I would also agree with Mark. I'm revising a social change book I started last June. It's already written. And I spent 7 months rewriting it. So rewrite. And by the way, my wife doesn't read it at all. So anyway.
Any other panelists? All right, we got another question over here. This gentleman.
Mark, this is directed to you. How long were you in the Congo, number one, and number two, is there any hope for that situation? It seems pretty grim down there.
I've been there a number of times, most recently last year. So I've been in and out. Is there hope? Yeah, I think certainly there's hope. My feeling is that the UN peacekeepers haven't been given enough latitude to defend villages, and this is something that the U.S. and the UN always kind of battle over. But I feel that with a more powerful UN peacekeeping force, now they have about 17,000, but they basically stay behind the fence, and they kind of come in afterwards. So they've developed a pretty bad attitude from many of the Congolese, because they show up after people have been murdered and raped. And that's kind of a policy issue. Again, we go back to how policy really matters. If the UN was given a little more power, and that includes the U.S. handing over power, you could solve a lot of those problems. I don't think it's hopeless. I don't think anything's hopeless, but it takes open-hearted policy, and that's not always in line with strategic policy.
Great. All right, well, please join me in thanking all of our panelists for their time and experience.